Good evening, everyone. I'm Karen Hostetter, the manager at Red Bank Community Library. Welcome to our third in our series of Zoom into History talks. Zoom into History is a collaboration of our library, All Vets of York, and Northeastern York County History in Preservation, commonly known as NACHIP. While both the library and NACHIP organizers plan successful in-person programming, we both realized that with the precautions needed to keep individuals safe at this time, we can work together to present quality virtual programs. So please use the chat if you wish to ask questions, as attendees will be muted throughout the presentation. We will share your questions and comments after the talk when we open for Q&A for questions and answers. Charles Stamball, who is the founder and president of NACHIP, will introduce our topic and our presenter this evening. Here you go,
Okay.
Charlie.
Okay, tonight we will hear about tactics of the Great War with Jeff Hawks. Why did World War I become bogged down in trench warfare? How did the Allies break out in the end? Why did it take so long to overcome the problems of trench warfare? Army Heritage Center Foundation educator, director Jeff Hawks will talk about the tactics of World War I and why the problem of trench warfare was so hard to solve. So let's welcome Jeff Hawks, and here he is.
Okay, thank you. Fantastic. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to my screen so I can get my presentation up. I'm very happy to be here tonight. I want to thank you all for, I want to thank everyone for inviting me and for coming out to hear me. I'm going to start with a little bit, tell you who I am and really what I'm doing here. So I'm the education director for the Army Heritage Center Foundation, and we are the nonprofits friends group for the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center up in Carlisle. USAHEC is part of the Army War College. We are an archives and museum complex. And my job as the education director for the foundation is to engage audiences that are not the typical target of Army educational programs. So I'm really happy to be here today and to help share with you a little bit of what I've learned and what we do here at the center. You will see behind me an appropriate backdrop. This is an FT-17 tank that we have in the collection. And if you've never been up here, you're welcome to come on up, and you can walk right into the exhibit hall, and there is the tank on display for all to see. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is really the culmination of two graduate papers that I wrote over the summer for my coursework. That is the culmination of this work, and it's I looked at the tactics of World War I and World War II. When this is over, I can make my bibliography available to you. I think you might find some of that reading interesting if you enjoy the topic. And I will say that at times I am going to read from my paper a little bit because I even with notes, I sometimes can't say it more clearly than I already did when I wrote it. So the questions we have, the questions that I put out, and which I hope that I will address, is why did World War I bog down in trench warfare? Why did it take so long to overcome the problems of trench warfare? That's really, in a sense, the focus of my talk tonight. And then, how did the Allies break out in the end? And what I really want to do is I want to send you away tonight with some new ideas. You may end up with more questions than answers, but I would consider that a win. What I did learn in the process of doing this work is that we do have a lot still to learn and a lot still to figure out about World War I. And it is significant that every age tends to reinterpret history according to their own understanding of the world around them. So I found that historical understanding has changed a lot, but bear with me, and I think I'll give you some new ideas and some new things to think about. So what I'm going to start with is I'm going to start with kind of talking about the standard versus the complex model of understanding the tactical situation in World War I. I'll talk a little bit about what tactics are and sort of the history of tactics and how they got to where they were in World War I, and then a little bit about how those tactics changed as the war went on. I think I should warn you now that there is not really a grand, happy ending to this story, in the sense that I do not adhere to the school of thought that there was some grand tactical breakthrough that finally allowed the Allies to break out of trench warfare and achieve victory. I think the ending of the war was a little less dramatic than that. The Americans certainly had an important role, but not necessarily a critical one. But we'll talk more about that as we get a little closer to the conclusions. So in the standard, really sort of standard model, the one that a lot of people sort of it's sort of in the air, in the water supply, so to speak, is that World War I is really commonly understood as this sort of unmitigated tactical disaster. What historian Patty Griffith referred to as a futile industrial slaughter, brought about by the stupidity or inflexibility of the high command that prevented a timely adaptation to new conditions. Now, I do have to point out that Griffith was talking about the standard model. He is not an adherent of the standard model. The pervasiveness of this view is due in part, a lot of it is due in part to the emotional need to explain this devastating war that ended without a grand victory to justify the cost. After the war, people were casting about, they were looking for an explanation. How could this happen? A variety of senior leaders shortly after the war and for the next several decades were writing their memoirs. Many of them who, of course, everybody has their own bias, and many of them were very easy for them to blame others and to not accept blame for themselves. So those all have to be taken with a grain of salt. But in the immediacy of the moment, of course, those are taken when the general who was there writes his memoirs. Those are accorded a lot of importance. But I think the need for this explanation was further intensified because subsequent events proved that not only had the war failed to resolve anything, really, the outcome created conditions that led to another global war. In fact, increasingly, I'm finding that historians really refer to World War I and World War II as two acts in the same conflict. Whether you adhere to that or not, that's a bit of an academic point. But the reality is that it wasn't the war to end all wars. It was just a prelude to an even larger conflict. And so the narrative that the war was begun by bumbling diplomats and prolonged by incompetent commanders who just refused to see or refused to do the obvious is attractive. It's very attractive, even to scholars with a historical perspective and an appreciation for the nuances of history. And it's attractive because I think if we look at it and say, well, they just made stupid mistakes. They just did stupid things, and we can learn from history and we can avoid that again. That won't happen to us again. And so it's very comforting to look at something like World War I and say, well, of course, we're not stupid enough to do something like that again. And you tend to find that actually fairly frequently in military history after a defeat. Reality is when historians study a victory, their immediate tendency is to say, well, why did we win? And so they focus on what went right. And when they study a defeat, they say, well, why did they lose? And they focus on what went wrong. And they miss, often, it's easy to miss the reality that a lot of things go right and a lot of things go wrong in any war, whether you win or you lose. But in the case of World War I, the fact that diplomats did bumble and that commanders were incompetent at times provided the necessary evidence to really solidify this narrative into the historical literature. And so what I'm really proposing, I cannot in any way take responsibility. This is not my idea. This is sort of my way of bringing together a whole bunch of other ideas from other scholars. I'm really standing on the shoulders of giants here. I'll make no bones about that. But what I looked at was, how does tactical change actually occur? What's necessary for tactical change to occur? And I came up with this fairly complex model that, and the real gist of it is that tactical change is hard. It's not always easy for people who have spent their lives studying military science to recognize that there's a problem. And even when they do recognize there's a problem, it's not exactly easy to say, okay, but what else do we do? And I'm very fond of a Japanese pun, heiho wa heiho desu. And what it translates to is the laws of warfare are the laws of human society. And we all experience this in our own lives when we sometimes fail to realize that we keep repeating the same behavior and expecting different results. And even when we do wake up and realize it's not exactly sure what we're supposed to do to change it. So in my research and looking at what other people had written and some similar models, I came up with really 8 points that, for me, distill what really needs to happen before tactical change can occur. And so what it takes is, the first off is you need to know what's going on in combat. You need to have an accurate picture of what's going on. And secondly, you need to understand it properly. And that right there is a major challenge. The fog of war intervenes. The difficulty of analyzing a battle in a new light, because situations have changed, as opposed to understanding it in the context of what you already know, of what you've already experienced. And then you need to look at it and say, look, it was the tactics that were the problem. If you failed to achieve success, or even if you've achieved success, but at considerable cost, it's really hard sometimes to look at it and say, well, we failed because we were trying to fight the wrong way. And you can say it was a lack of preparation, a lack of support, a lack of sufficient manpower, just plain bad luck. But somebody has to look at it, and it has to be somebody who has the authority to initiate change, has to look at it and say, okay, we've got a problem here. We've got to find a new approach to doing this. Then you need the stuff you need to make changes, whether it's technology, whether it's support, whether it's the infrastructure. You're going to need staff members to tackle the problem, try to figure out what to do. You're going to need training facilities. You're going to need soldiers to get trained up. So there's a lot that needs to be done to develop and test the new tactics. And then once they've been developed and tested, somebody has to say, okay, we're going to do it. And then it needs to be institutionalized. And there's a lot that goes into that. You have to create manuals. You have to get it out to leaders. You have to train the troops. And you have to say, more or less, at some point, okay, going forward, this is the way we're going to fight. Now, an interesting thing here is, and this really, a lot of this happened in the British Army, was that some of that happens at the local level with soldiers adapting to the conditions and making decisions. Well, we're going to do this instead of that. But that does not lead necessarily to wide tactical change, because, okay, a couple privates in a squad over here saying, hey, we've learned this lesson, we're not going to do it that way anymore. They don't have the ability to disseminate that. They can't get it up to the leaders. And so the change really needs to be broad, to take place on a large scale, really needs to come from the top down, with an interesting exception that we'll get to when we talk about how the Americans did it. Then you need leaders and soldiers capable of learning. As we'll talk about a little bit later, but some of these new ideas were problematic. I'll give you a preview of one of them. When they developed the technique of the creeping barrage, which was an artillery barrage that would slowly advance across the battlefield, the soldiers would hang back. They didn't want to get too close to the shell fire. And it took a while in some cases to get them to understand, no, you need to be right up behind the shell fire, because that shell fire drives the enemy into their bunkers. And you need to be right on top of them when the shell fire starts, so that you can, when the shell fire stops and moves on, so that you can get them before they get into their back out of their bunkers and enter their fighting positions. So it took the soldiers a while to understand that they were in less danger from following right up behind that barrage than they would be if they hung back too far and allowed the enemy to emerge from their bunkers and reoccupy their fighting positions. And then number 8, really none of this matters if you don't get it done in time before the war ends. So we'll talk about that in a little bit here. So let's talk a little bit about the nature of warfare, the fundamental problems, how we deal with those fundamental problems, and a few definitions here. So the fundamental problem of warfare, as I formulate it, is how to apply force to impose your will on the enemy. There are a lot of other definitions of it, and I encourage you, if you find it interesting, to go take a look at it. But I feel that they all boil down to that. The process of warfare is using coercive force to get somebody else to do what you want to do, not what they want to do. And so there's a number of methods that we use to do this. And I think the method that is most obvious to people, and what most people think of when they think of warfare, is that you advance to seize and hold ground. If you're on the offensive, or if you're on the defensive, you prevent the enemy from advancing and holding ground. And that's really what I think most people think of as the majority of warfare. And I think part of the problem in World War I is that as soon as we got into trench warfare, that sort of model went out the window. We're not advancing to seize ground. We're not. We're definitely holding ground, but the armies had really prepared for mobile warfare. They expected a war of maneuver, and instead they got a war, a static trench war. So there's another method, which is to destroy the enemy's capacity to fight. And you do that by attacking logistics, their support units, or going after their infrastructure. But this really requires the ability to project force beyond the battlefield, beyond the immediate front lines. And that's a capacity that largely didn't exist in World War I. Of course, they knew about it. Earlier wars, Civil War, full of examples of raids. You send the cavalry in to do a lightning raid to destroy a rail junction. They understood that, but in World War I, when the race to the sea began, they attempted to use their ability to flank. The flanks of any military unit are extremely vulnerable. And so once the entrenchment started, well, they said, okay, so they're entrenching in front of us. We'll go to the left or the right, and we'll come around them. And well, they just kept entrenching out further, and you ended up with a race to the sea. So that method was really taken off the table. And so you had a third method, which is attrition, which is you just keep banging. It's when all else fails, you just keep banging your heads together until somebody's head gives. And that's not considered an optimal way to fight a war, but sometimes it's the only thing you have left. And there was a lot of that in World War I. But I think it's a mistake to think in terms that was the goal. Throughout the war, leaders on both sides were saying, how do we get out of this? How do we get past the trenches? How do we restore open warfare? a war of maneuvers so that we can use encirclement and flanking maneuvers to bring this thing to a rapid conclusion. And the extent to which I think they banged their heads together was a recognition of the difficulty of doing that. Just real quick, the difference between tactics and strategy. The Army states that tactics is the employment of units in combat, including the ordered arrangement, maneuver of units in relation to each other, the terrain, and the enemy, to translate potential combat power into victorious battles and engagement. Well, that's, there's a lot there. Griffith defines it as any specific ploys or arrangements that are agreed upon for use by a small group of soldiers in battle in order to achieve their immediate objective. But I think it's a lot simpler to say tactics are the methods soldiers use to solve problems of combat on the battlefield. Combat is a problem-solving exercise. You have something you're trying to do. You have somebody who's trying to prevent you from doing it. And so how do you solve that problem and achieve a successful equation, a successful outcome? Tactics should be distinguished from strategy, which is there's again 1,000 definitions of strategy, but I think simply put, it's an overall plan for the application of military force for the achievement of national goals. So if tactics is the art of winning battles, strategy is the art of choosing which battles to fight, when, where, and why, as part of a coherent plan to achieve a designated goal. So I'm not going to be really talking about strategy today. I'm going to be talking about tactics. And I do want to mention doctrine, because of course doctrine encompasses both tactics and strategy. But doctrine is an Army's official statement of this is how we do things. This is how we fight. This is how we apply the methods. These are the methods we use to apply force. Okay. So what are the tactics? What do we have that's going on here? And tactics, I break them down into really 4 categories. Tactics are the way all these 4 things come together to translate into methods of fighting. And so you have their weapons and your equipment, and that refers to both the capabilities of the weapons and their employment. And the question for the tactician is not simply what the weapons are capable of, but how they are best employed to take advantage of those capabilities. Just because a new weapon is capable of being employed in a certain way doesn't mean that it's obvious that it should. And there's really actually a good example of it right here. You see this picture on the lower left-hand side is Val Browning, John Browning's son, with the Browning automatic rifle. And this was the standard automatic rifle / light machine gun for the United States Army from World War II through Korea. And it was developed in time for World War I, though it was not broadly deployed into battle. They weren't quite sure what to do with it. They weren't quite sure what was the best way to employ it. And they were a little concerned about putting it into the front lines and seeing and see, part of the problem with tactical innovation is if you try something new and it fails, you lose the battle. So that's really something that is a considerable concern to folks for who are in charge of this thing. So the other thing too is that sometimes the weapons you have rely on the development of another piece of equipment that you don't have, that has not been developed yet, and so you can't use it to its full capabilities because you just don't have the technological ability to do it. And we'll see that a little bit when we talk about communications in the Great War. Fieldcraft and maneuver. Maneuver refers to how infantry forms for battle and moves across the battlefield. What kind of formation do they use? How do they stand? Where do they move? Do they run? Do they walk? Do they crawl? And such that. And fieldcraft is related to movement. And those are the things such as the use of cover and concealment, camouflage, defensive work such as foxholes and trenches, and various means of communications such as shouted commands, hand signals, signaling devices, flares, smoke, etc. Kind of an interesting thing about the trenches. the trenches were in one way a defensive fortification that gave considerable power to the defensive side. But I think another way to look at the trenches, this is what was necessary to survive. It wasn't possible to survive above ground in the battlefield at the time. And so the trench is, in its own way, we think of it as primarily defensive, and I don't think that's wrong, but the trenches it creates the possibility for the offense. There's no other way to get troops into a position where they can start an offensive unless they can move up to the front underground. Leadership and organization. How to organize and command military units to take advantage of their capabilities. And I have two examples up here that I just think illustrate the point of how important organization is. Military units, you'll sometimes hear them referred to as square organization. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to triangular organization. A military unit that has a square organization has 4 subunits, and a military organization that is triangular organization has 3. So a square platoon would have 4 squads. A triangular platoon would have 3 squads. And typically what you end up with is the square organization can handle more missions at once, but with slightly less powerful formations. The squads would be smaller. Whereas a triangular can handle fewer missions at once, but has more powerful units to field. So that's one thing that you see changing during the war is the organization. Historically, the infantry was a soldier with a rifle. And one of the organizational questions is, what do we do with these special troops? We have mortarmen, we have machine gunners, we have grenadiers, and we have troops with flamethrowers, you name it. And these were initially organized as separate fighting units. And so you would have a machine gun company or a machine gun battalion attached to the infantry. And so the general historical trend, and you start seeing this as we move through World War I, is the greater integration of those in the within the units. So as you go into the unit, you go into World War I with a squad is just 7 riflemen. You come out of it, they've added an automatic rifle. You go into World War II, and they've got the squad. The squad has an automatic rifleman. It's got a machine gunner. It's got a guy with a bazooka. So they start putting these special capabilities right into the unit, because what they're learning as they're going through the war is that the problem of coordination, they need troops to be able to react to the conditions on the battlefield without waiting for instructions from higher command. That's going to be a very important element of how things change and develop in the Second World War. And then finally, you've got the leadership, and that's really important. That's going to be really important in the war here. And you're going to see tremendous differences between the United States, the British, and the Germans. I didn't look at the French because most of the sources that I found were in French, and I can't read it. But so it's not just what is the unit capable of, but what is the leader capable of. And so you have a process during World War II or World War I of putting more authority down at the local level so that these local leaders have more opportunity to make decisions, more authority to make decisions, and better training so that they can do it. And it's a delicate balance, because you get too much command and control from the top, and you have frontline unit commanders who don't have the discretion to make changes that they need to make. But if you give them too much leeway, you end up with a low-level commander who decides to zig while the rest of the army is zagging. And so that's a problem too. So we're really talking about 3 armies here, 4 armies with the French. I didn't really look at the French, but you got 3-4 armies trying to figure out, what do we do? How do we handle this? What kind of changes do we need to make do something effective in this environment. So let me talk a little bit. Do we have any questions that have come up yet? Any questions that?
Nope, go ahead.
Okay. So let me talk a little bit at how we got here. And really, World War I occurred at a moment in history when changes in military technology had outpaced military experience. There had been a lot going on in the previous century, as the development of more available weapons. But so starting at the dawn of the 19th century, the United States Army, most armies of the world, used a basic form of tactical doctrine that had been in use for centuries. And it basically was soldiers clad, wearing bright uniforms, marched in close order, rigid formations of tightly packed soldiers with dozens, sometimes hundreds of soldiers. And officers marched these formations around the battlefield, seeking an advantageous position from which to fight. And strict discipline was the order of the day. Soldiers exercised no individual discretion or initiative whatsoever. They followed orders. They had to follow orders. And really, these tactics were adaptations to the dominant military technology of the time, which was the muzzle-loading musket with fixed bayonet. These weapons were really inaccurate, and so they really had to pack all these soldiers in close and tight in order to get mass fire, and you'd have dozens, maybe hundreds of muskets going off at once in the hope of hitting something. But then the idea is you're going to move in close, and eventually you're going to go out to the bayonet charge. So non-commissioned officers, their job was to maintain order in the ranks. And to relay off the orders from the officers, and that was about it. The black powder created lots of smoke, so hence they needed the brightly colored uniforms so that commanders could see their troops and identify them as well. So by the end of the 19th century, you start to see some changes. Now, the rifles had been available for quite some time, but a rifle requires a tight-fitting barrel in order to impart spin to the bullet, and they found that the slower rate of fire, because it takes longer to reload a rifle, was not compensated for by the range and accuracy increase. So this is where they are. They've made some changes. They developed the mini ball in the rifled musket, but they're coming out of a century where this is how you have to fight, and they're aware that it's starting to change. They're aware that the new rifles are more accurate. They're breech loading, which means you can go prone. You don't need to be standing or kneeling to reload them, and they're also They develop smokeless powder, which makes cover and concealment more valuable to the soldiers as well, because you can actually hide. It's really hard to hide on the battlefield when your rifle produces a giant cloud of white smoke. But they're still not exactly sure what to do with this. And they really didn't make tremendous doctrinal changes. Their formation started to loosen up, but they really had this concern about command and control. They still wanted to advance across open ground in regular formations. And even casual students of history are aware of the appalling results. But Griffith actually says, I think he gets it about right. What happened in 1914 was that the armies finally put into practice the conclusions they have reached after many years, and in fact, many decades of deep thought. They were perfectly well aware of the problems posed by new weapons, but believed that they had found the scientifically correct solutions. They had examined all the options and chosen the least costly. It is for this reason, and not because they were out of their depth, that generals clung so stubbornly to the methods they had chosen. All other methods seemed to offer far more dubious results, if not total disaster. So here we have it. The best minds, they've been looking at the wars that have been going on, and every war you find all throughout the 19th century, there's military observers from all over the world watching what's going on, and they're looking at this and they're saying, what's the best way to deal with these new weapons? And they're drawing the conclusions that these close order tactics are the way to go. And Griffith is not the only one to reach this conclusion. A lot of historians have said, look, yes, the casualties were appalling. They expected appalling casualties. That was expected with the new weaponry. And they did not recognize immediately that this was a failure. They did not. They said, yes, okay, we sent a lot of guys out there, and a lot of guys became casualties. We expected that. So the combination of the fact that they had studied, that they had thought, that they had planned, that they thought they came up with a solution, it wasn't immediately obvious to them that it wasn't working. They said, well, this is the price. This is the price. And the interesting thing is, even with the development of the machine gun, one of the real benefits of the machine gun wasn't its capacity to mow down large numbers of troops in a short order of time, but the ability to do it with fewer soldiers. One man with a machine gun could take the place of dozens, perhaps hundreds of riflemen, but a trench full of rifles with aimed rifle fire on troops advancing across no man's land in the enemy really would not have failed. I don't believe they would have fared much better against a trench full of riflemen than against machine guns. Machine guns just made it possible to mow them down with a bit more efficiently. But I'm not sure it changed the outcome all that much. At the same time, we had increased artillery. The artillery fire was much more accurate, and that was due towards the advances in artillery fire, and so the artillery was also more deadly. But so as Griffith puts it, since infantry had always fought by massed fire, the machine gun was merely doing mechanically what previously a platoon would have done manually. If technology had made preparatory artillery fire a little more important to the assailant than it had been in the past, that did not seem to make a very decisive difference to the time-honored relationship between attack and defense. So it really took them until about 1915 to really catch on, okay, this really isn't working. They went into the trench warfare. The first weeks of the war were open. They fell into trench warfare. They said, okay, we'll get out of this pretty soon, just a hard enough push. And for a while it was like, yeah, okay, we just need to push harder. We need to push harder. We're taking casualties, but we need to push harder. But by 1915, it really became apparent. They said, okay, we've got a problem here. This isn't working. We need to start figuring something else out. So what did they do? Okay. What did they do? Sorry, I misplaced my notes here. Give me a sec. Okay. So in pre-war doctrine, infantry was the primary arm, and you start to see, and you'll see it down at the bottom, the emergence of combined arms. But World War I was still primarily was still an infantry war. So they go into the war with this idea that all these supporting elements are nice to have, but really the infantryman with a rifle and bayonet can carry the day. They begin to understand, okay, we need to do different things here. So some of the things that they start doing differently. Well, let's take a look here. It doesn't take the French long to realize that bright blue coats and bright red pants are problematic. They never get rid of the blue entirely. The other armies did a much better job of it. The Germans with their gray, and the Americans and the British with their browns and their greens. But they start to realize, okay, we've got to make some changes here. By the end of the war, virtually everybody started the war with soft caps. They're ending the war. They all end the war with helmets. So there's changes in equipment there. They start learning, how are we going to use artillery? And so what you start seeing is the development of the creeping barrage. And the creeping barrage is a very carefully planned attack in which it's very carefully timed that the artillery just starts moving forward bit by bit and the infantry follows on. The creeping barrage really became critical in allowing the infantry to survive long enough to get across no man's land and start doing something in the enemy fortifications. And they got very good at it. They could literally put you in a box with barrages to the left and right and to the front and to the back, and march that box across the battlefield so that by the time you get there, the barrage has just lifted off the enemy, and you can get into the trenches and do a lot before they're able to come out and resume their defensive positions. The machine gun, again, to a great extent, the machine gun really just reduced the number of soldiers you needed to achieve a high volume of fire. And that certainly had an effect in terms of the ability of the freeing up soldiers for other duties. So certainly that was a tremendous effect. And the machine gun, they need to learn how to overcome the machine gun, but they started to work on that, and they became very good at identifying and reducing machine guns positions, whether by artillery or by precision rifle fire. They started using fieldcraft and maneuver quite a bit, so that they would start taking cover, and they would seek a covered and concealed position from which to reduce that machine gun team. Communications remained a problem throughout the war, and that was really a big challenge. Of course, runners are slow and sometimes don't get through. Carrier pigeons a little bit faster, sometimes don't get through. They did have telephones and telegraph wires, but those wires could be cut by artillery fire or even precision rifle fire, and they needed to be buried 6 feet deep in order to protect them from artillery fire. But that meant that your headquarters couldn't move very easily, and it certainly was not possible really to lay wire behind an advancing unit so that they could maintain communications with the rear. And that would be a real problem, and that continued to be a real problem, because one of the, as we'll see, one of the things that you have to do is, once you achieve success breaking through the enemy lines, you need to capitalize on that. And if you can't even communicate back to your own lines and say, hey, we've broken through, then they don't know whether or not to commit the reserves to back you up. And so those communications remained spotty throughout the war, and they never really got that well sorted out. Radio was in its infancy, and so they had real problems. And just to give you an example of how difficult communication was, the expectations were that it would take about 6 hours for an order to reach the company level once it had been issued by a corps headquarters. Just by comparison today, well, if that email is transmitted electronically, if that order is transmitted electronically, you could be there in seconds. Even if it's has to pass through a variety of headquarters before it gets down to the company level, it can travel very fast in a matter of minutes. Now, the Germans in particular were very good at developing special teams. They were particularly adept at integrating those special teams, and these were built out of their pioneer units, which were essentially engineer units that they had in place prior to the war. The Germans had a number of advantages that allowed them to innovate very, very quickly. We're going to talk about a little bit as we move on, but the fact that they had these engineer units ready to go, that they were used to operating somewhat independently, and that the Germans had a very professional corps of NCOs was really very, very beneficial to them. And really, German innovation proceeded in the most orderly and disciplined fashion. And they're famous, of course, for developing the stormtroops, who were so effective at getting into and making their way through trenches. And so those special teams included wire cutting parties, another parties that it was their job to breach the wire. Now, they learned how to do that with artillery as well. And that was a critical element. They had to learn how to do it. What kind of artillery is most likely to cut the wire? But also, as you're advancing, what do you do if you get up there and something's gone wrong and the wire hasn't been cut? That's where your special team comes in. And you need to have your special team with you, and they need to have the initiative to say, okay, somebody has to say, over there, that's where I want you to go through. So again, you see that it's the new techniques, it's the command and control to take advantage of those techniques, and it's the organization to apply those new techniques. So if your artillery doesn't cut your wire, what do? You get up there, and somebody has to say, all right, wire cutting team, right there, that's where I need you to go. And so again, you're in this position where you're having to push command authority forward. That's not something that can be planned for in advance. That's something that a decision that has to be made by the commander on the spot. And this is really critical, I think, to the changes that are taking place in World War I, is the command responsibility being pushed further and further down the chain of command. You end up with lieutenants and sergeants making decisions that once upon a time would have been up to colonels. But the colonel can't be there. They've switched to an open order formation. The unit is all spread out. The colonel can't be anywhere, can't be everywhere. So somebody else has to make that decision, and they've got to figure out, how do we do this? How do we position these special teams so that they can be wherever they need to be when they need to be? And how do we prioritize who gets them? So all of this takes time to figure out. All of this takes time for the armies to say, how do we do this? How do we get through the wire? How do we solve these problems? Fieldcraft and maneuver, you see, as I showed in the picture, the move away from the bright colors, the increased use of cover and concealment. Now, night operations were still limited. They'd send out raiding parties to bring back prisoners, gather information, and carry out special missions, but they didn't do a whole lot of night operations. There was also a concern, and this was really something that it took folks a long time to wrap their heads around. And there was a concern that if you give individual soldiers the option of choosing when they move, where they stop, where they go from there, the soldiers want to move from shell hole to behind a rock to behind a tree to another shell hole to find these positions where they can be safe as they advance forward. The commanders are afraid that if they just let the soldiers do that, they're going to find a nice hiding spot and stay there. Nobody had ever tried this before. They're used to, their model is you put men shoulder to shoulder and you march them right up against people who are shooting at them. They're not going to do that unless they're subjected to strict discipline. And if we switch to this open order formations, you're going to end up with a lot of malingering. Well, turns out that wasn't true. But who wants to be the first person to experiment with that? Who wants to be the first person who puts their soldiers out there and says, let's find out what happens if I give them freedom to do what they choose? If it turns out that they all run away, well, now you're in trouble. And before you know it, you might have real trouble if the enemy is able to exploit that. So again, there's this, how do we do it? But there's also this caution. If we do it wrong, we lose the war. If we do it wrong on a grand scale, who knows what's going to happen? So these are the problems they're having. For organization and leadership, the German army was able to react more quickly. Even before the war, their NCO corps, their sergeants, this was an upwardly mobile track. You got into the army and got in as a non-commissioned officer. You had a bright future ahead of you. It was a way for you to work your way up in society. And so their NCO corps tended to attract a lot of bright and ambitious and energetic individuals. By comparison, some of the other armies, well, if the NCO's job is to enforce discipline, who do you put in that job? Well, the biggest, loudest guy you can find. Not necessarily the most energetic, not necessarily the brightest. He doesn't have to think. He's just passing on orders. You want him to be loud and you want him to be imposing so that people obey him. So the Germans were predisposed to begin working in this way. Again, I'm going to get to the Americans in a minute because they really had something unique going on there in the American Army. But the British had a real problem here, and it was because of their class-conscious society. There was really a lot of difficulty getting some of these upper-class officers to believe that a sergeant from a Welsh coal mining family could make these kinds of decisions. And so the British Army was very slow to develop that. So you see the combined arms emerging. You see this new flexible way of fighting as smaller and smaller units begin to take more and more initiative lower on at lower levels in the military. So I want to talk real briefly. I know we've been going a while here. I'm going to talk real briefly about the case of the AEF, because the AEF is really something very, very kind of special, very American in the solution that they come up with. And really what's going on is that Pershing arrives in Europe determined to do things the American way. Obviously, he's looking at these folks. He says, well, you guys haven't figured it out yet. And so the idea is that the British and the French are going to provide training to the American forces, but Pershing is like, okay, you're going to teach them how to use trench warfare, but we're also going to train them up on open warfare, because once we get past these trenches, it's going to be open warfare again. But what happened is, because of the urgency for getting the American troops into the line, he set it up so they're going to learn trench warfare first, then they're going to learn the stuff I want them to learn for open warfare. They did the trench warfare, and then the situation just got too desperate, and they said, we've got to put them in the line. Okay, so the Americans go into the line. Well, what Pershing didn't realize was that the principles required for trench warfare were now required everywhere on the battlefield. Even if you broke out into open combat, this business about you can't march in close order formation. You have to coordinate closely with artillery. You can't expose yourself. You've got to suppress the enemy with artillery fire. All these things, the creeping barrage, these techniques devised during trench warfare were needed for all warfare now. So what happens? Pershing tells his guys, this is how it's going to be. And we come to the Battle of Belleau Woods, and the 2nd Infantry Division goes in and suffers a catastrophe. The troops marching across an open field, no close coordination with artillery. The Germans are just sitting in their positions. They can't believe what they're seeing. These guys just walking towards them, and it's a disaster. What happened was, from there is, as I said, I think uniquely American. The commanders at the division level start implementing what they learned from the French and the British, contrary to what Pershing really wanted them to do. And essentially, the way they learn to fight by fighting, but they learn to fight by implementing these lessons really contrary to the wishes of their commanders. So if you look again at this model, you have the leaders and soldiers. The American Army was in a tremendous position. They were better positioned to learn the lessons of the battlefield quickly than anybody else, because they had 4 years of warfare to look at. They had 1914, 15, 16, 17. Well, by 18, they're training and getting out there. But they're looking at this and saying, we should be able to figure this out. And so they were able to skip most of this. And what happened is you had leaders and soldiers who said, no, we're going to do this. We're going to make these changes, even if it's not what our commander wants us to do. So they do. And within a very short period after the first debacle at Belleau Woods, within a month, they're seeing tremendous success. And in fact, it's a really interesting thing, because after Belleau Woods, the division's 3rd Brigade, which wasn't involved in Belleau Woods, executes an exemplary attack on the village of Vaux. And they take like a handful of casualties, a few dozen casualties in the process, doing everything the way the French and the British taught them to, which is not what Pershing wants them to do, but it works. And so you have this wonderful situation where not only are the U.S. commanders learning, they're learning from each other and effectively disseminating doctrine without going through higher headquarters. So they're really skipping they're just sort of skipping over this obstacle number 6 here, and going right to implementing the new training and making the difference. So why did World War I bog down in trench warfare? Well, ultimately, I think what it boils down to is the soldiers were driven underground by the new firepower. They were driven underground by machine gun fire. They were driven underground by artillery fire, and they couldn't get out of it. They lacked the ability to get out of it. And really, one of the interesting things that comes out in my studies is that why did it take so long to overcome the problem of trench warfare? Well, okay, we've looked at some of the obstacles. It's hard. The solution wasn't obvious. They had to figure it out as they go along. It's really easy for us to look at with historical hindsight and say, oh, this is what they should have done. But the reality is they had this long process of, we don't know what to do. We're going to try this. Nope, that doesn't work. We're going to try this. And they have to do it cautiously, because the price of failure is losing the war. What was the real problem, though? Once they solved this, they figured out how to get through. They figured out how to break through. The spring offensive. In the spring offensive, the Germans smashed through the Allied lines. They cut a gap 50 miles wide and just pour through it. And before too long, they just run out of steam. They're exhausted, and the offensive collapses. So how did the Allies break out in the end? To a real extent, they didn't, and that's kind of the mythology of that's built up around World War I, because the real issue was, once they figured out how do we get through the front lines, the next question is what do you do then? So just getting through the lines, the next part is reinforcements. Get reinforcements through those lines, exploit that, get into the rear areas, and start wreaking havoc. The reality of trench warfare is that the primary advantage of the defense was the ability to reinforce a defensive position, to bring up reinforcements, to bring up replacements, to bring up the supplies faster than you could get reinforcements across no man's land. You get across no man's land, you break through, you've penetrated into enemy territory. Now you've got to get word back. You've got to get word back. They've got to get the reserves moving. They've got to get the reserves across no man's land, which is still hazardous, even if you've taken the front lines, because it's still vulnerable to artillery fire. You've got to do this all again and get them through and on and continuing on, and you've got to keep them supplied while you're doing it. That's hard. And they couldn't do it. They couldn't get across no man's land with a unit, and they couldn't, when they did get across no man's land with a unit, they couldn't keep that unit supplied and moving forward. And so how do the Allies break out in the end? Well, they start making these incremental movements. They do start, but a lot of historians would say there was never a restoration of mobile warfare. The front line started shifting, but it was still trench warfare, just on a shifting basis. And what happened in the end? There are a lot of people who will debate exactly how and why World War I ended. I think from my review, the historical consensus of the moment seems to be is that Germany was just exhausted, on the brink of collapse, and the final straw being the addition of the Americans, who were fresh and ready to go. and completely, had all the untapped resources of a nation that hadn't been through 4 years of war behind them. And the Germans, just some people in the German government looked at the situation realistically and said, this can't go on. We've got no way out of this. And so really, from a tactical point of view, they never really solved the problem of trench warfare until we got to World War II, when the advances of technology and communications, the real advance of the tank, allowed them to not just open a hole in the enemy lines, but actually exploit it and move forward. So that's really the end of my presentation. I hope it's been useful and educational and interesting to you, but I'm happy to take any questions that anybody has right now. I'll do my best to answer them.
Okay, you're welcome to unmute yourself to ask questions if you wish. I don't see anything in the chat right now. So I have to say that's an interesting perspective on how the war ended. I don't think I ever heard that before, Jeff. That's
yeah,
and
I went into this looking for sort of a happy ending, and the Americans came in and charged to the, and broke the whole thing open, and away we went. I really don't think it was quite the triumphant victory. I think at the end the war really kind of ended not with a bang but with a whimper. Okay, so a question about the pandemic of 1918 playing a role in trench warfare, and the answer to that is yes. I will be frank with you that I did not look a whole lot into that. But there are some interesting accounts of it. Of course, the pandemic was rampant in the trenches, and illness was pretty rampant in the trenches. You got people living in miserable conditions. Of course, the troops did not spend year after year after year in the trenches. They were rotated through, so every few weeks they'd rotate back, and they'd shift between being in the reserve trenches to the frontline trenches to the rest areas in the rear. But what happened is that if you look at the reports, they start to see a number of an uptick in a number of soldiers just going missing for a few days. They go missing for a few days, and then they show up back at their unit, and we don't have specific evidence, but the historians I worked with, who are much more well-versed in the war than I am, the prevailing theory seems to be is that soldiers got sick, they took themselves out of the line, they went back into the rear, and they rested for a few days until they got better, and then moved back and rejoined their unit, and that the armies just made a decision not to prosecute that as long as they came back to their units. And of course, as we know, the particularly the 1918 flu was very severe for a number of people, but for most people, really, it was just a bad case of the flu, and then they were okay after a few days. Insights into the war at sea. A question I have about insights of the war at sea. I will tell you that my area of study is the Army. I have looked at the naval campaigns a little bit. It's not an area where I'm really an expert, but I will say this as a general, as sort of a general note. The Germans really were counting on the submarine warfare to help them out, and it didn't help them out as much as they wanted. In fact, I would argue that submarine warfare, because unrestricted submarine warfare was such a political issue in the United States, it was really a big part of turning the United States. In 1914, the Americans didn't know which side to support, particularly here in Pennsylvania. Lots of Pennsylvania Dutch had family at home. There was in Germany. There was a lot of sympathy, and it wasn't exactly clear as to which side we should be on. You have to remember, of course, this was barely 100 years after the British had burned our capital. So we did not have the relationship with England that we have today, or even in World War II. So the unrestricted submarine warfare, the sinking of the Lusitania and some other ships with Americans on it was very bad for German PR, and they failed to close they failed to close the Atlantic, and the British and the French continued to get the supplies they needed. And the British and French blockade on Germany was much more effective. And Germany was really running out of foodstuffs towards the end of the war. This is a significant contribution to their collapse. It wasn't just the military situation that was getting bad. It was the political situation at home. Charles has asked me about the movie War Horse. I have never seen it, and I'll be completely honest about why. I'm an animal lover, and I'm not sure. My wife grew up riding horses. My daughter rides horses, and I'm not sure I want to see that. Maybe I'll watch movies about people doing terrible things to each other, but war is human folly. I do not like the idea of getting animals. This is my personal opinion. I do not like the idea of getting animals involved. And so I'm not sure how I would feel about watching that movie. I did watch 1917, and I'm a movie buff, and as far as movies go, it's certainly a cinematic achievement. I would not watch it. I would not watch it with an eye to getting much of a historical view out of it, but it's certainly a fabulous movie to watch. Did both sides use chemicals in World War I? Yes, they did. And chemical warfare, it was used by both sides. The Germans used it first, and if again, that was not my specific area of study, but if I recall correctly, their first attack was with chlorine gas, and it was very effective the first time. And fortunately, the Germans were not ready for it to be as effective as it was. It was never again as effective. They tore a huge gap in our lines. Panic, people going, just abandoning the trenches. And so, if they had been ready for that, they did not expect it to be that effective. If they had been ready for that, that could have been a game changer. But the protective equipment came into play very, very quickly. And never again had the great effect that it did have. Even today, when I was trained in chemical warfare, what we were told is that the primary benefit is it forces people to put on their protective gear, which reduces their fighting efficiency. The mustard gases came later. And the mustard gases could be a little bit more insidious because they were odorless and would fill trenches and would sink to low areas. And so you might be out in no man's land and dive into a shell crater to take cover, and the shell crater is full of mustard gas, and now you've got yourself a good dose. Mustard gas did not affect you immediately. It would cause you to blister up later. And we actually have some diary, actually a memoir from a soldier who talked of going into his dugout some time after and not realizing that his fresh uniform had absorbed the mustard gas. He put on the uniform, and he basically said, "Yeah, it was just a little bit, but it made me peel like I had a sunburn." So, but it blinded a lot of soldiers. So Scott is saying here that his great uncle survived a gas attack, lived, and had emphysema for the rest of his life. So yeah, it could cause lifelong difficulties.
All right. I don't know if you can see Nicole, but she said Testament of Youth really got her into World War I.
I'm not familiar with that. Is Nicole, is that a film? Is that a movie?
Vera Britton wrote it. She was a World War I nurse.
Oh, okay. We actually have a documentary that my predecessor did on Army nurses of World War I. That's an absolutely fascinating story. The Army started at the beginning of the war with something like 450 nurses. I mean, the nurse corps was tiny. They trained 20,000 nurses and sent about 10,000 of them overseas. The nurses worked at at field hospitals that were not terribly far behind the lines. They didn't get any kind of combat training, but they trained with the gas masks. And I'm trying to remember. I don't remember off the top of my head. I would have to look it up, but some of them were decorated, and I think there were even a few that were killed as a result of enemy action. And of course, they were as vulnerable to disease as the troops were. In fact, I mean, they're in the hospitals with them. So many of them died of disease or accidents or injuries. So, but it's a really tremendous. I'm a huge fan of Army nurses. I got my head stitched up by an Army nurse in Saudi Arabia when I did something stupid and bumped my head. So it's tremendous. And we do have information. If you go to armyheritage.org and look at the soldier stories, we have a couple of Army nurses up there from World War I as well. So Charles wanted to know, yes, we do have trenches, 400 feet of trench line. So, and that's on the Army Heritage Trail, which is outdoors. Our galleries are open if you come in and wear a mask and practice social distancing, but you can also come and enjoy the trail outside. So yeah, absolutely. Mark, you have a question about AEF training.
Hi, how are you? I'm wondering what your opinion is. Do you think that you would characterize the training that the AEF received stateside prior to going over as optimistic in a way, in as much as, you know, they prepared for trenches, dug on fields here. Okay, here's a ditch, there's a ditch, and you charge across it. But then, you know, you think about like San Quentin with the canal and a tunnel, and like, do you think that for all the trench training that they did, it really wasn't enough in the end?
Of course, the training they got in the States was basic soldiering. They got a lot of the, when they didn't do a whole lot of the tactical training until they got to Europe, where they were actually trained by French and British troops. No, I mean, I think it's not really, they didn't finish the training program they were supposed to have. The British and the French couldn't wait. So the training was abbreviated. The American commanders, certainly from Pershing, questioned the utility of that kind of training. There was something of an attitude, well, you know, Americans are Americans and have been for a long time. There was something of an attitude of, well, if these guys are so smart, how come they're still here? So yeah, you know, the AEF did okay. So the training wasn't terrible. Of course, they could have always used some more. And you know, I mentioned the 2nd Infantry Division, which adapted very quickly, but the reality is that not all of our units, some of our units did poorly. And so, you know, yeah, they absolutely could have used more training. Some of them got more training than others. The ones that got there earlier got more training. So, you know, the short answer to your question is no, it wasn't adequate. There's always, you know, you always need more training, but the guys did okay. The Doughboys did okay. And so I see Pat wants to know where the term doughboy came from. And as I understand it, we're not entirely sure. The prevailing wisdom seems to be that it was tied to the love of donuts, and the fact that the Red Cross and the Salvation Army made lots and lots of donuts for our guys. I've heard other people say it was because the dough-like color of our uniforms. I don't know specifically. I think the donut is probably pretty likely the right answer. We did have a reenacting event here a few years ago where I was reenacting, and I was digging a foxhole and right across from the World War I trenches, and we had some Salvation Army reenactors who were making fresh donuts using a World War I recipe. And I got to tell you, those things are great. So I've had fairly authentic World War I donuts, and they're pretty good.
Well, that may be the end of our question and answer. That was a really a lot of good questions, folks.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Okay.
Okay, I want to thank everybody for participating with us this evening. We appreciate your comments. Please know that we're going to continue next year with a new series. We're going to have possibly up to 6 different Zoom presentations next summer, spring and fall.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank Jeff Hawks for a very informative and enlightening program this evening.
Thank you
The
for having
topic
me.
close to my heart, since my grandfather and his brother and other relatives served in World War I, and it's given me a little bit more perspective on what happened there. You know, and that history's gone from me because I don't know. I don't know much about where he served or when. But so thank you very much.
Yeah, let me just say, if I may, if you have a relative who served in the United States Army, you can always come to the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center to see what we know about them. And particularly if you know their unit and their dates of service, we can often do very well in terms of finding a unit history, so you have an idea of what they did. So come and visit us.
Okay. Well, I have to tell you, my my dad's information is all in Carlisle. That's where he went in and went out of World War II, and his information's already up there. And he donated several items to the museum. So, okay. So again, I want to thank everybody. Thank all of our attendees. Please stop by the library if you can. We have a wonderful display of World War I items that were lent to us by different people. We have the Smithsonian Institution posters that give a really good overview with an educational guide that you can pick up and follow along with the posters. We have some poppies from the VFW, so you're welcome to take a poppy to proudly remember our veterans. Okay, so stay safe, everyone. Stay connected to the library. Good night, Jeff. Good night, Charlie. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take a big blood.
Okay, thanks.